Hi, my name is Allison, and today we're going to be looking at Reaganomics. So, by analyzing the president himself, the history surrounding this economic ideology, the fundamental economic models, along with Reaganomics and its overall effectiveness at the time, we'll gain a better understanding on Reaganomics as a whole. So, a little backstory on Ronald Reagan himself. Ronald Wilson Reagan was the 40th U.S. president, and he served as president from January 20th, 1981 to January 20th, 1989. He was seated president during one of the deepest post-World War II economic downturns, but even during that time, many people supported him and the ideas he had from a poll they conducted then. He believed in laissez-faire economics, which is the belief that economies and businesses function best when there's no interference by the government, and it's a French term meaning to leave alone or allowed to do. It's basically one of the guiding principles of capitalism and free market economy. But he was also a believer in supply-side economics, which we'll get more into later. So looking at the 1980 Reagan Revolution, Reagan inherited an economy in stagflation. So in other words, there was high inflation, high unemployment, slow economic growth, and stagnant demand. Generally, people were not financially stable, and the economy itself was not helping the American citizens either. Looking at a Phillips curve, you can see that the Phillips curve makes a rightward shift, showing that there's both an increase in inflation and unemployment. But he found a way to combat it through the creation of Reaganomics. Based on Keynesian ideology, the key to returning the economy to full employment is changing the aggregate demand itself. So by things like cutting taxes and increasing government spending, people will feel more inclined to work and consume since less of their money is being taken away from taxes, therefore shifting both aggregate demand and supply toward long-run equilibrium in an expansionary way. However, Reagan thought otherwise, since he saw that consumer spending was the main driver of the economy at the time, with consumer spending accounting for 70% of economic growth. So he then decided to focus on that instead as a key to changing the American economy and improving it from its recession. By focusing on consumer spending and behavior, he based his concepts around two economic methodologies, one being supply-side economics, which we mentioned before, and another being Laffer's curve. So supply-side economics is basically how changes in marginal tax rates influence economic activity. So in other words, how much of one's additional income must be turned over to a tax collector. Higher marginal tax rates basically is equivalent to discouraging income, output, and efficiency of resource use. Because with increasing marginal taxes, there's less incentive to earn, and with less incentive to earn, workers will create less production as a result. So he uses his background knowledge to then implement the trickle-down theory, which targets tax cuts specifically instead of just general marginal cuts. The other economic methodology used was Laffer's curve, which was created by Arthur Laffer, the father of supply-side economics, in 1979. Laffer's curve describes how changes in tax rates affect government revenues. So an immediate reaction, described as an arithmetic effect, looks at how raising taxes correlates to more revenue, whereas the long-term effect, being the economic effect, looks at how raising taxes causes less tax revenue. You can see on the Laffer's curve graph how starting from zero with zero tax revenue and zero tax rate, when you increase tax rate, tax revenue actually goes up until you hit point T. And after point T is when tax revenue starts going down and tax rate continues to rise. So that's the economic effect, whereas the first one was the arithmetic effect. So ideally, an economy and a country should be staying in the arithmetic effect because no country would want raising tax rates and with less tax revenue as a result. So knowing what he based Reaganomics on, now we can look at the actual regulations he enforced. So he basically made cuts in 4 different areas, being government spending, income/capital gain taxes, government regulation, and money supply available. So, through cutting taxes, he enacted two tax bills in 1981 and 1986, which caused top income tax to be slashed from 70% to 28%, and for corporate tax rate to be slashed from 48% to 34%. So basically, with more money available for the businesses to manage, its intentions were to help corporations to have more investments and to encourage employment and aggregate output. Similarly to cutting taxes, by loosening government control on the businesses, Reagan hoped that allowed them to pour more of their money and efforts into growing their business and improving employment. He also decreased government spending on social programs such as Social Security, disability insurance, and food stamps, because by spending less money on these programs, more money would be in circulation for consumers, which actually helped balance out the reduction of the money supply. By encouraging the Federal Reserve to limiting the supply of money, less money would be in circulation, helping combat inflation. So this would actually cause a shift in the money supply curve in the money market to the left, allowing for less quantity and less inflation, as you can see from the graph itself. So these four pillars of Reaganomics address the issue of high inflation and high unemployment rates at the time of the recession and encourage growth in consumer demand and stagnant growth. Overall, Reaganomics' fiscal and monetary policies were meant to predominantly shift aggregate supply to the right, allowing aggregate demand to follow in suit, closer to long-run equilibrium in an expansionary way. You can see this in the graph above. Looking back now, we know that there's a lot of controversy surrounding Reaganomics, and during the actual recession, there was actually no major improvement made to the economy. In fact, by March 1982, unemployment rates reached 9%, and in December of that year, the unemployment rate stood at its recession peak of 10.8%. Public debt rose from 26% GDP in 1980 to a full 41% GDP in 1988. There was also a huge unbalance of wealth throughout America, with income growth dramatically slowed for the middle-lower classes and raised for the upper classes. Despite all of this, inflation rates did fall, though, from 4.1% to 4.1% in 1988 due to the monetary policies enacted. So now that we know the concepts of Reaganomics, we can look at the ineffectiveness surrounding it. So the main issue with the ineffectiveness was the inconsideration of behavior economics. And behavior economics is a method of economic analysis that applies the psychological insights into human behavior to explain economic decision making. So essentially, Reagan put too much trust into the wealthy consumers and businesses and the potential of investment into the economy with their additional income. So we know that expectations of inflation causes a shift in the aggregate supply curve. So with low inflation, people try to spend more, causing a rightward shift in aggregate supply, whereas with high inflation, people try to stockpile and not sell, causing a leftward shift in aggregate supply. So although inflation did decrease during the Reagan Revolution, Reagan didn't really consider the citizens as humans, and instead he treated them as economists. So when economists see inflation decreasing, they would automatically correlate it to wanting to spend more, causing a rightward shift in aggregate supply. However, as humans, we don't think as pragmatically as economists. And with the instability of the recession the citizens were in, it makes sense that consumers would not feel inclined to invest money into the economy simply because they fear what might happen in the future and if the recession could get worse, because they don't know what might happen in the future. So in the end, the wealthy people and the wealthy businesses ended up just sitting on the additional money and causing unemployment rates to soar and really not contributing to economic growth. However, looking at Reaganomics now and knowing that the circumstances of the recession And the main issue of the recession was fear itself and the very drastic and extreme measures. Reaganomics could have worked in a more stable environment such as today. So, for example, in a setting where the economy did not have really extreme inflation and employment, the fiscal and monetary policies that Reagan set out could actually benefit our economy today and help increase economic growth. So after looking at the whole picture of Reagan himself, what he believed in, the circumstances he was in, what Reaganomics was built on, and how it failed or how it succeeded during the time, I hope that you have a better understanding on Reaganomics as a whole and how it might affect us in the future or might be implemented in the future. Thank you for listening.